It's UofL Today on 93.9 The Phil. Here's your host, Mark Hebert.
And welcome to UofL Today with Mark Hebert on 93.9 The Ville. So glad you're joining us today. Hopefully for the next 30 minutes or so, you stick around and learn something about the University of Louisville. And before we start with our guest, I wanted to talk about something that happened last week at the university. It was a big announcement for a company called Lawrenz that grew out of the research at the University of Louisville. And Lawrenz has landed a $100 million investment to continue human trials of a technology that will help kidney transplant patients stay off immunosuppression drugs for the rest of their lives. And it's a big deal for Lawrenz. It's a big deal for the university because it shows that U of L can work with investors and industry to bring potentially life-saving ideas to the marketplace. So congratulations to U of L and Lawrenz on that, which happened last week. All right, coming up on the show today, it's called the Center for Predictive Medicine. What is it? It's U of L's lab for research on really dangerous and deadly viruses and drug-resistant bacteria. Things like Zika, West Nile virus are part of the research at that center. We'll talk to one of the researchers there. But first, like most professions, doctors are faced with potential conflicts of interest all the time. Should they prescribe a drug or recommend a medical device from a company that paid them a consulting fee? Should they divulge that information to patients? Well, Dr. Hiram Polk is a longtime surgeon and former head of the Department of Surgery at the University of Louisville, and he's written some articles about conflicts of interest and ethical dilemmas facing doctors and how docs should solve them. Dr. Polk, good to see you as always.
It's funny how that sort of evolved. You look 30 years ago, there were, I think, the black bag I was given when I graduated medical school was a gift of a drug company.
Really?
Yeah, it's a very simple thing. The second thing, which I think is really interesting, is I was making $35 a month as an intern. I had a little daughter.
When was this? What year was that?
What would be 1960.
Okay.
Yeah, 1960. So doing this, and I have a little daughter, and the Meade Johnson guy delivered Infamil to the house every week with her nutrition.
Baby formula.
She grew up, never drank milk in her life. So I wanted Infamil, and things like that went on, and very low key, and I was obviously grateful for that.
Right.
And somewhere in the late 60s, I made what was a fairly important discovery that you could modify infection after surgery by giving antibiotics just before the operation, where it had always been given just after the operation. And that turned into a huge moneymaker for Eli Lilly. And the next few years, I'm giving several talks about this in many, many places. And I found out that Eli Lilly was providing the expenses for my host. And I sort of worried about that a little bit, and I'd just make a brief announcement. I thought that was fine. And finally, after a couple of years, I said, if you want me to come, I'll come, but it's not going to be sponsored by any drug company. And I just was uncomfortable with that because it was the drugs, the 2 or 3 drugs that worked the best were Lilly products.
All right. Well, let's back up a little bit. Let's talk about conflicts of interest. So you wrote a paper about this that you hope to help other surgeons, other doctors kind of wind their way through this, what can be potentially a minefield for them. So when we're talking about conflicts of interest, what kinds of things do we talk about? You talked about with drug companies and things, and I mentioned a few. What are we talking about the potential for conflicts for doctors?
Well, I think the number one thing is it's gradually increased over time till about 10 years ago, in which doctors were often given stock in a company, depending on how willing they were to speak laudably about the company's products.
So wait a minute. So I'd heard about fancy trips to Hawaii and those kinds of things, but they were actually, so like Eli Lilly or another company, a drug company.
I don't think Lilly probably ever got into it, but
some other
did.
startup company or something like that might say, you know what, you go out and talk about how great our drug is, we'll give you stock in the company to doctors?
Or like you just quoted on the thing that might modify transplant recipients. That's an example where clearly cooperation between academia and industry is necessary to get things done.
Right.
And you've got to be very careful as you want to be. I think the story is you want to be transparent about it. But conversely, you don't want to close all that out, because that's been many of the great advances in medicine have been the products of a full-time faculty member at a medical school working closely in hand with a drug company. But the issue there is to say it. And it turns out that over time, there was lots of different kinds of inducements given to doctors for things.
Such as?
Well, old fancy trips.
When you said stock, fancy trips,
dinners, nice trips to exotic places to tell how wonderful their drug is, that sort of thing, and then receive a large fee for a 30-minute talk. So a lot of that stuff went on, and it began to concern a number of people. I was the editor of the American Journal of Surgery for 18 years, and that began to be a problem. And what began to be a problem, you knew there was a guy over here taking a lot of money from Company X, and he wrote no conflicts of interest to declare. Well, it's not. Do you count a nice dinner as a conflict of interest? Pretty small. Do you count a fancy trip to the Caribbean in the winter? Pretty big. It depends. So that has evolved, and we've never been able to come to proper grips with that. I think I was very encouraged last week that the American Surgical Association, which is sort of the senior or most elite surgical organization probably in the world, had trouble getting its members to admit conflicts of interest. It's easy to check the box no, and sometimes you don't remember that dinner, you don't remember the occasion, you don't remember the $200 honorary check, you don't remember those sort of things. That's all right. So they began to do this, and I was just ecstatic with the progress. In 2017, there were 17 reports out of about 30 papers.
Reports of
conflict
papers
of interest.
On a paper that they had written about something.
About something that was a conflict of interest. The next year there were 19. This year there were nearly 50. So it looks like that people are buying into this and think this is the right thing to do and feel good about coming clean. And they don't say, I'm doing anything, but I have received such and such from companies XYZ.
We're talking again with Dr. Hiram Polk, who is a longtime surgeon, former head of the Department of Surgery at the University of Louisville. We're talking about conflicts of interest that he has written about and talked about in these different organizations that he belongs to, organizations of doctors. So what's the big deal for patients? Why should surgeons, doctors, others have to report that they've got some relationship with a drug company or took something from a medical device maker? Why is that important to Joe patient?
Well, I think the vast majority of patients couldn't care less, and they're very grateful the doctor's going to do the right thing for them. That may not be true, and if a patient is concerned, if they have any level of concern, the simple question, doctor, have you done any work with this company that manufactures this device, the company that makes this drug? And they'll probably get a straight answer. Some organizations, the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, of course, is an example of doing an awful lot of things right. They have a little sheet that's given out to patients there is that many faculty and or doctors on our staff consult with drug companies and participate in development. Most do not. If you'd like to know anything more about that, please ask your doctor. Very few organizations have followed that. And conversely, Mayo on the other side now is driving its faculty absolutely crazy because they've got to fill out a 3-page form.
So it's gone too far.
Yeah, it is. And trying to find the right balance about that is really important.
We're talking with Dr. Hiram Polk, who's a longtime surgeon. Many of you may know him, and the former head of the Department of Surgery at the University of Louisville for several years. And we're talking about conflicts of interest in surgeons. So I think what I heard you say is that it's getting better, that the reporting is getting better by surgeons and doctors when they have these potential conflicts.
Yeah, and conversely, there's some number of people who take lots of inducements that they don't have any conflict. But gradually, the idea is it's become the norm to admit that and to feel good about it.
All right. And you also said that the Mayo Clinic encourages folks, if you have any questions, ask your doctor.
At the patient level.
At the patient level, ask your doctor. How many patients you think are willing to have the guts to say to the doctor who's treating them, hey, you got any conflicts of interest? Do you have any interest in this drug that you just recommended that I use and prescribe for me? Do you have any interest in that company?
No, I think the majority would not, even if they were a little concerned about it. They won't. They don't tend to want to question their doctor because they think it's sort of like asking for a second opinion. 20 years ago that was a slap in the face to the doctor. You wanted a second opinion. Now it's probably good medical practice, particularly if something's complicated or difficult.
Right. So people just won't ask.
I don't think they'll ask.
Right.
And I don't know whether all large clinics like ULP, the University of Louisville physicians, you might come up with something like that. A number of our doctors are involved in drug development and device development with several companies. The majority are not. If you want to know anything about that, you ought to specifically ask your doctor.
Do you think that the drug companies are still out there and the manufacturers of medical devices are still out there hoping that they can get Dr. Smith over here to push their product and while they give him a a trip to Hawaii, or has that been totally banned and that's not happening anymore?
It looks as if it's not happening anymore. There was a regulation passed as part of something at the National Institutes of Health about 5 years ago that sharply restricted what any kind of company, and in this case lobbyists, could do for Congress members, what you could do for physicians, whatever. So it's really been closed down to a trickle. You can't even buy a dinner.
And that's good.
Well, I think
in your mind, right?
It's sort of overdone because I mean I'm not going to do anything over a hamburger, but the truth is that it can be overdone. But finding the middle ground about this is real important, and the issue is transparency. And I sort of like the Mayo idea. They do a lot of things well. The idea of say, here's
reporting.
the statement.
All right. Well, I've got you here. We only got a couple minutes left, but while I've got you, I've got to ask. You've been at U of L for how long? How many years?
47,
Long
48,
time.
48, yeah.
What's the biggest change you've seen in U of L medicine in those 48 years?
Well, I think the biggest part has been, number one, the increase in class size at the medical school.
That's good.
The fact that we've got vastly more women in medicine, nearly half of each class times women. What's not so good, we've made very little progress in getting African-American people into medical school.
Mm-hmm. And that's just not U of L. That's
nationwide. Nationwide. And they've got so many, a bright African-American person has got so many other opportunities, and you don't have to get into educational debt. Educational debt for physicians right now is a big deal. Yeah. You avoid that, they can go other places.
Are the surgeons who were graduating from U of L better than you were? You're supposed to say yes. I hope the answer is yes.
Well, if you talk about categorically over a long time, the curve is yes, vastly so. I'm so proud of many of them. They lead surgery programs all over America, and they're absolutely wonderful. And they were better than I was when they left here, and all they've done is get better and better. Nicest thing happened to me last week. I had dinner with two separate ones on separate nights. One had surgery at Dartmouth, the other at the University of Michigan, and just doing exciting, good things. It's their generation, it's their leadership. It's fun to see it.
Very good. Dr. Hiram Polk, always good to see you. U of L is doing research to come up with drugs to combat some of the worst diseases, viruses, and bacteria on the planet. Matt Lawrenz is an associate professor at the Center for Predictive Medicine, the CPM, which is where this research is going on, and he's here to talk about the CPM, as we like to call it. Right, Matt?
I am. It's good to be here.
All right, CPM, Center for Predictive Medicine. What does that mean? What is that thing?
So the CPM is where the majority of the infectious disease research that's going on at U of L takes place. So there are about 20 faculty members that are part of the center, and we all have a general interest in how bacteria and viruses cause disease. Ultimately, what we hope to do is use what we learn about those diseases to predict or develop new therapies, drugs, vaccines to combat these diseases.
And the CPM, the Center for Predictive Medicine, is located on the Shelby campus, right? The Shelbyhurst campus?
We're actually split in two areas.
Okay.
We have a location on the Health Science campus, and then over on the Shelby campus, we have a very special building out there known as the Regional Biocontainment Laboratory. This is one of 13 different laboratories that the NIH funded about 10 years ago, specifically for infectious disease research. So it's a very special facility that's unique to U of L that we use to study some of these very infectious organisms.
Yeah, I've been in the lab before, back when it was built, 8, 9 years ago, something like that. And they've got some interesting work going on some really bad stuff out there, right? And that what you're trying to solve is these real bad bacteria and viruses and those things, trying to come up with antidotes and things like that, right?
Exactly. It's the facility is set up so that we can safely work with these organisms, and that allows us to then try to develop new therapeutics or vaccines to combat the infections that they cause.
So what are some of the things, just kind of give me a for instance of some of the things you're working on?
So out there, again, we work on bacteria and viruses. Some of the diseases that people might be familiar with is we do some research on influenza or flu. There are people that work on HIV. My laboratory focuses on bacteria, so we study bacterial infections. There are people that also are interested in some of the kind of emerging infections that we hear about on the news, like Zika virus, West Nile virus, those types of diseases. Okay. So there's quite a few out there, and again, the goal here is to understand them, to better combat them, and protect people in Louisville and around the world from acquiring these infections.
And in layman's terms, how far along are you on any of these? Coming up with something to battle Zika or something like that?
Sure. So we're in different stages. Some of the research is to understand the disease, of course. But we have, for example, Dong-Hu Chung is a virologist, and he's been working on new antivirals to combat diseases like Venezuelan equine encephalitis, which is transmitted by mosquitoes. And we see that here in the U.S.
A lot of mosquito-borne problems out in the world right now.
Exactly. Those are the re-emerging
Right.
or emerging diseases that we hear about a lot in the news nowadays. So he is to the point where they have identified new drugs that they are now trying to test to see if they'll work to combat the disease in humans.
So we're doing them on mice or rats or something like that, I assumed, using small
A lot of
animals.
the work that we do is preclinical before we move
Right.
into humans to establish whether or not it's going to be effective and can move forward to that next stage. So, for example, in my laboratory, we're very interested in multi-drug resistant bacteria. And these are bacteria that at one point used to be susceptible or treatable with antibiotics like penicillin, have over time are no longer treatable in this case. And so we're trying to figure out if there are new antibiotics out there that will help fight against these infections.
We're talking with Matt Lawrenz, who is an associate professor at the Center for Predictive Medicine at the University of Louisville. And since you brought it up and went right into it about these bacteria, I've had a number of guests on this show talking about the drug-resistant bacteria that are out there, and they're getting to be more numerous that doctors just don't know how to treat them, and infections as well. So that's exactly what you're working on, right? So,
yes.
So is your job to, I guess, first identify what some of these bacteria are, because some of them haven't even been identified. Something shows up in a hospital in Somalia or someplace, and it's like, what is this thing? This is brand new. I haven't seen this one yet.
Right.
Or we've seen it and have no way to treat it, right?
Right. And so what's happening is we're seeing these more frequently, and they can be in Somalia, they can be in the hospitals here in the U.S. They pop up, and they're hard to treat. And the real problem is that there hasn't been a lot of new drugs or antibiotics developed over the last 20 years or so to fight these infections. So from my lab, what we're interested in is helping to identify those new drugs that hopefully we can move into the clinic and start using to treat patients that may acquire something like MRSA, one of these drug-resistant staph infections that people hear about. Or another big one that we work on is known as Pseudomonas. And this is another infection that people that are in the hospital tend to acquire. And unfortunately, nowadays, these Pseudomonas bacteria are very resistant to antibiotics.
Now, I don't think anybody's heard of Pseudomonas. At least I haven't. So most of the folks listening to the show probably haven't either. So what is it?
Pseudomonas it's a bacterium. It's actually a bacterium that you find in the soil most of the time. But in cases where people are in the hospital, maybe a little immunocompromised because they're in the hospital for a different reason.
Or cancer drugs or something
Exactly.
like that, right?
Are more susceptible to infection. And so Pseudomonas will take advantage of that. And we see this a lot of times. They will cause infections if people go in to, say, have a joint replacement or something. Or cancer patients, individuals will acquire Pseudomonas in their lungs and develop pneumonia with Pseudomonas. And what becomes difficult with this is that, again, they're multi-drug resistant. They're hard to treat with antibiotics. And so these people take a long time then to go through treatment to try to cure these diseases.
And it can be deadly.
Exactly. And the Centers for Disease Control and the World Health Organization have been very concerned about this for the last 10 years at least. And they've seen this rise in the number of these cases of bacteria, either Pseudomonas or MRSA or others that are resistant to these drugs. And yes, if we don't have antibiotics that can treat them, they're very, very deadly infections.
We're talking with Matt Lawrenz, who's an associate professor at the University of Louisville, and he works at the Center for Predictive Medicine, and he works on these he works primarily with bacteria and trying to figure out what it is and come up with ways to treat it. But there are others out there who are dealing with a multitude of different viruses, bacteria, and other things, and trying to solve those problems. So with the FDA, you've got some sort of contract with the FDA, right?
Yes.
That has something to do with your bacteria work, right?
So
what is that?
I'll take a step back. We've been partnered with the National Institutes for Health, or the NIH, for about the last 5 years to help them identify these new drugs. And so working with them, we have models put in place that allow us to test whether these drugs are effective or not. And then the NIH can use those then to help make decisions about whether or not to move those drugs into clinical trials to treat patients that have these multi-drug resistant.
So you getting the drugs here in Louisville, they're sending them, the CDC sending them to you, and you get them and test them on mice and say, yeah, this one works, this one doesn't, or this one's got promise or this one doesn't. Is that essentially
exactly
what's going on?
Right. So we help them decide on whether or not there's promise to move into the clinic. And so we've been doing that for about 5 years with the NIH, and then more recently...
NIH, I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's the NIH. But more recently, we've begun to work with the FDA, or the Food and Drug Administration, to help them in kind of a similar fashion in gauging whether or not these new drugs that are being developed all around the world, actually, are going to help patients in the hospital. And this contract with the FDA is very exciting for us because it allows us to essentially make a better model to try to predict the efficacy of these drugs. And ultimately, this model is something that researchers at the University of Louisville could use to test their drugs, or like I say, we do a lot of work with researchers from around the nation and even across the world to help them identify the best drugs to hopefully help us combat these infections in the hospital.
So you have these contracts with government agencies. Do you have contracts with drug companies who are looking to push their drug or to see if their drug meets the standards or not?
So we do work with drug companies, and so some of those will come through the NIH. They'll partner up with the NIH or the FDA to do this. Some of those will partner up directly with us. We have the tools in place to help them, and so they'll contact us, and we can work with them to help. So it's not only an academic model here, but we're working with industry to try to help them also to improve this.
So is this a drug pipeline we're talking about?
Exactly. So we are kind of in the middle of the pipeline. So the beginning of the pipeline might be the identification of a potential drug. We're in the middle to test if we think it's going to work against the bacteria. And then hopefully the data that we generate will allow the drug company or the NIH to move it to the clinical setting to test in preclinical or in clinical testing for these drugs. So yes, it's a pipeline that we try to fill a gap for the rest of the community.
Again, we're talking with Matt Lawrenz about multi-drug resistant bacteria and the work that he's doing at the CPM, which is the Center for Predictive Medicine here at the University of Louisville. How bad is this stuff? We talked earlier about it can cause death, but I mean, is it just one or two people out of 100,000 that potentially die from this drug-resistant bacteria, or is it getting worse?
It is getting worse. So we're seeing a rise in this, and the problem is because there's a misuse of antibiotics in the clinic. And so overuse of antibiotics, the bacteria will eventually figure out ways to avoid being killed by those antibiotics. And so as they develop resistance to those antibiotics or an inability for those antibiotics to kill them, then we have to find new drugs to treat them. And to think about this, the number of these strains or these cases in humans is going up every year. And it's a big problem in hospitals. So hospitals are very concerned about this because without antibiotics, you can't treat these diseases. And bacterial infections, or maybe if we say the advent of antibiotics has really allowed medicine to progress to the amazing things that we can do today. Without antibiotics, open heart surgery is very difficult because you can acquire these bacterial infections that can kill people. Joint replacement. Antibiotics are necessary to make sure that you don't get a bacterial infection when you go in for surgery. So as these antibiotics are no longer useful, medicine in general is going to be hurt by this because the procedures that normally we would say, oh, we're going to go get a hip replaced, no big deal, now becomes a big deal because you have to worry about potential for infection.
And you've been working on these new antibiotics, I guess we could call them, new drugs, potentially to treat this bacteria for 5 years, I think you said. So in that 5 years, have you seen anything that's come through the pipeline here at U of L that you said, ooh, this could really change the world? So
we have. So there's been some very good drugs that have come through that have shown very good efficacy that I think the data that we've helped generate for that will help those drugs to move into the clinic. And so I think that we're having progress towards it. It's slow, but I think with with growing concern about these drug-resistant bacteria, we'll get more and more people trying to combat these infections.
And more people, meaning more and more researchers.
Researchers.
Not just at U of L, but everywhere else.
Exactly, everywhere. And so, and hopefully with the pipeline that we have in place, we can help not only people at U of L, but and other companies or even academic institutions.
Talking with Matt Lawrenz again from the Center for Predictive Medicine at the University of Louisville. I want to real quickly talk about some of the other things that you got going on. We talked earlier about Zika and some of the other things. And as I recall, there was, it seems like mustard gas and sarin and some of these other really bad things that are out there. I think U of L or at one time was working on some of that, trying to figure out some antidotes to that. Is that still going on?
So we do still do some work on, I guess, what they call biodefense research.
Right.
And these are, from our point of view, what you mentioned were kind of chemical weapons.
Right.
Or potential chemical weapons. Right. Some of the researchers in the CPM do focus on biologicals. So, for example, there was a big anthrax letter scare.
Right. Yeah, I remember that.
A while ago, which would be considered kind of a biological weapon. Mm-hmm. We don't have people working on anthrax at U of L, but there are people that do work on other organisms. So, for example, part of my research project works on plague. And we try to understand how plague causes disease so that we can develop, for me, what I'm interested in is being able to develop a vaccine against this disease.
Well, please tell me the plague isn't coming back.
I hope not. It's always around. It's actually, we do see a few cases in the U.S. Out in the West, and we do see where plague becomes a bigger problem is in developing countries in Africa and Asia, where you see more incidents of that. In the U.S., I think the diseases that we're worried about are going to be those emerging viral infections with climate change, especially these mosquito-borne infections like Zika and West Nile. With climate change, you're going to see insects moving up north that normally would be in the South or Central America. And probably an increase, unfortunately, in the incidence of these types of diseases. So we have very dedicated scientists in the CPM trying to understand those diseases and develop antivirals, in that case, to combat those infections.
Well, obviously, very important work for the future of our planet and humankind. So we appreciate you doing that, and thanks for being on the show.
Great. It was good to be here, and I'm glad that we had a chance to talk about some of the research going on.
All right. Thank you, Matt Lawrenz, who's an associate professor in the Center for Predictive Medicine at the University of Louisville. That'll about do it for this edition of U of L Today with Mark Hebert, which you can hear every Monday and Tuesday night at 6 on 93.9 The Ville, except during baseball season when U of L baseball games are on Tuesday night here on 93.9. So we moved to Wednesday night. So Monday and Wednesday night, the U of L Today with Mark Hebert on 93.9 The Ville. You can check out all the U of L news, videos, and events at uoflnews.com. As always, thanks for listening to U of L Today with Mark Hebert, and go Cards.